Hey, this is Professor Cicerelli. So I just wanted to talk for maybe 15 minutes about summarizing and paraphrasing and quoting. So we'd spoken earlier about the three ways that you integrate outside sources into your papers. All of these are opportunities for you to use in your own writing, in doing your research. So it's important that you know how to do each of them. The first we said was quoting. Quoting is when you're taking a source, either a secondary source, primary source. You're taking that source in its exact words and you're importing them into your paper. Now, there are a couple of things you need to know when you're quoting. One of those things is that you don't want to distort the source if you're bringing it in, because so oftentimes we're not going to quote big chunks of the quotation. So it's important that we not take a quote out of context. Okay, so we'll pay attention to that as we go through in a second. The other thing with quoting, and really with quoting, summarizing, and paraphrasing, is that you have to give credit to that source by citing it. And we talked about citations, that you need to have that in-text citation at the end, wherever that quotation ends. And we're going to see eventually wherever that summary or paraphrase ends. So at the end of that quotation, you're going to need a in-text citation. Now, if you are going to be incorporating a quote, there are some other things your textbook here recommends, which is that sometimes you use what are called signal phrases, so that you're not always just copying and pasting quotes. Other times you might want to include the author's name in what's called the signal phrase. So here the signal phrase is, Gerald Graff argues, and then blah blah blah. You could do other ways. You can do signal phrases too, and I think your book even gives you some examples of, like, according to so and so, based on so and so's research. And when you do that, if you use that as a way of introducing your quotation, you don't need to put the author's last name in the in-text citation at the end. You only need to have the page number. Okay, but you definitely need that citation at the end, because that's telling whoever's reading your paper where did you get this information? Because they're gonna see your in-text citation, they're gonna flip to your works cited page, and they want to be able to identify what source you got that quotation from. Okay. I said that when you use quotations are in some ways overused, because they're just they don't really show the reader that you've necessarily digested and understood the quotation. But there are ways that you can add a quote, modify a quote, that allow you to show the reader that you actually do understand the quote deeply, rather than just copying it and pasting it. One way you can do that is by using what are called ellipses and using brackets. And we'll look at that right now. Ellipses here. So ellipses are, you've probably seen them before, maybe you just didn't know what they were called. They're the three dots here, three periods that your computer will space out for you when you put them in your word processor. And what they show and what they indicate to the person reading your paper is that you've cut some words out. That there's certain words in the quotation that you didn't think were that important, and you don't need. That's one way you can indicate to the person reading your paper that, look, I've studied this quotation. There are parts of it that I think are important, parts of it that are not important, and that's how you can indicate that, is by cutting out some of the quotation. with using the ellipses there. Now, like I'd said a couple seconds ago, you don't want to chop out parts of the quotation that actually change the meaning of what the quote is saying. Like, you don't want to chop out, if someone's saying not important and you chop out the quote and make it say important, well, that's, now you're completely changing what they've said to the opposite. So you want to make sure you're not doing that. When you use ellipses, you don't need to use ellipses at the beginning or at the end of a quotation. It's only if you're chopping out words from the middle of a quotation. So as you see here on screen, it's the ellipses is chopping something out between seems to cross ... the line of indecency. Okay, so there was something in the middle there that whoever the author of this is didn't think was important. You also notice in this example that the writer of this article, who's quoting this author, Antonia Peacock, because Antonia Peacock is mentioned in that signal phrase or in that introductory phrase to the sentence, we don't need her name again at the end. Also, all we have at the end of the sentence is the page number. We don't have her last name. Okay. What you can also do to a quotation to show that you've understood it, digested it, is use brackets. Okay, brackets you might have seen before. And if you look at this example, I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see. Right there, those are brackets. And what the brackets tell your reader is that I, the writer of the paper, have added something to the original quote for clarity. Okay, maybe the sentence mentions, maybe the important sentence that you want to include uses a pronoun like it, they, them, and you want to clarify. You don't want to include the entire previous sentence that mentions what the it and who the they or them is. So you just add you'd add that information in brackets. And the way you tell the reader of your paper that these are not the original source's words, they're mine, is you put them in brackets. Okay, use the brackets. Right? You wouldn't use you wouldn't use the parentheticals. You'd use the brackets, which are right next to the P on your keyboard. Okay, so that's quoting. I mentioned to you in class that you don't want to use quote. You only want to use quoting when the wording of the source is important. And your book mentions exactly that. Your book tells you that it's when the wording itself is significant in some way. Okay, if you're going to be explaining or expanding on a particular word usage that the author is using, then you would want to directly quote. But if just the idea that the quote is portraying is important, then I would suggest you use summary and paraphrase. Now, I think I told you that there's a tendency with people who are just starting out doing papers, especially longer papers, academic papers, research papers, to overquote because they take up some space. They don't require a ton of thinking about or digesting. So there's easy to copy and paste. They should be the exception. The rule should be summarize and paraphrase, unless there is something important about the wording. So I don't want to give you an exact number of how many quotes you need per, versus how many summaries or paraphrases you need, but it should not, your integration of sources shouldn't be 95% quotations. It should be you putting things in your own words. And that would mean summarizing and paraphrasing. So summarizing and paraphrasing, when you use summary and paraphrase, you also need to mention the author's last name and page number in that in-text citation. Okay. You could also, just like with the quotation, you could also introduce that author in a signal phrase, and then at the end of your summary or paraphrase, you'd only need the page number. Okay. So what's the difference between summarizing and paraphrasing? Well, they're both opportunities for you to take the source and put it into your own words. The difference is that when you paraphrase, you are keeping the source about the original length. Okay, so if you look at the example that I have here on screen, you have the original source up top, the source by Sandra Steingraber, and then you have someone who's paraphrased it, and you'll notice they're about the same length. Okay, I mean they're probably the same number of sentences, about the same length in terms of word count. You'll notice at the end of the paraphrase it has our nice in-text citation because we've introduced the author's name up here in a signal phrase. But looking at them closely, you'll notice that the paraphrase does not borrow any of the phrasing or the word usage that the original source uses. And I'm going to show you an example in a second of a time where paraphrasing goes wrong. But it very much takes the ideas, takes the ideas, distills them, figures out what they mean, and then puts them in a new way. And I've given you the suggestion that when you're summarizing and paraphrasing to not have that original source open in front of you, because the tendency will be to look at that original source and then start to borrow some of the phrasing from that original source. And if you do that without putting those phrases that you're borrowing from the original source into quotes, then you've accidentally plagiarized, technically. I can probably tell that it's an accident, but you don't want to run into that issue. And so here's an example of a good paraphrase where you've got same length as the original source, but very much written in a different way. Now look though at this. I'm going to try and go down a little bit so you can still read the original source up top. Okay, so you can still see the original source up top, but look at this paragraph on the bottom. So you've got your original source on top, you've got the good paraphrase in the middle, and then you have an example of a paraphrase that accidentally plagiarizes on the bottom. Now look at why it's accidental plagiarism. Okay, you can see some of those highlighted yellow phrases are exactly like from the original source. Now classic experiments, synthetic dyes derived from coal. You're taking like 3 or 4 words in a row that are exactly like the original source. This group of workers had skyrocketing, okay, exactly from the original source. Okay, the original source was this group of workers had skyrocketed, but there's a lot of similarity there. I would say too much similarity there, and that's why it's highlighted in yellow here. So what does this mean? This means if you are going to use these phrases from the original source, not only do you have to give the author credit at the end in the in-text citation, which is done here, but you also would have to put each of those yellow highlighted phrases in quotes too, because they're not your own wording. It is Sandra Steingraber's wording, and you are importing it into your paper, so you would need to give her credit for that. And you'd give her credit for it, not just with her name in the in-text citation at the end, but also with quotation marks, because it's her wording. Okay, the ideas are hers, and the wording is hers, so you'd have to give her credit with the quotes. Okay, so that's paraphrasing, and you'd want to paraphrase when the original wording maybe isn't as important, okay, but also when maybe the details of the source are important. I'd also mention that if you're trying to show a step-by-step process, if you're quoting something that's a step-by-step process, or it's important that all of the details are intact, then you might want to paraphrase, because summarizing, as we're going to look at in a second, summarizing condenses and shortens. And so if you really want the reader of your paper to see all the details, then you're going to absolutely want to paraphrase. Okay? But if the details really aren't important, just the author's conclusion or the whatever main point the author is trying to make is important, then you can simply summarize. The details are not necessarily important. Okay, so that'll be up to you. And that's the kind of thing that you might write. You might do a paraphrase in a paper and then decide in another draft that, look, I don't really need this. I don't really need a paraphrase here. The details aren't important. Just the conclusion or the main idea is important. And then in revision you could just change that paraphrase to a plain summary. Okay. But just like with paraphrasing, a summary you also need to cite at the end. You also need that in-text citation, as you can see here. So, as your book tells you, you do not present the details. Summaries are generally brief as possible. I would say a sentence or two, no more than that. So you can summarize a paragraph, summarize an entire paper, entire essay, an entire source. So look here at, we have this same Sandra Steingraber source here, and it's based on the same source here about synthetic dyes and testing on dogs, etc. And so you'll notice that the summary version is much different. So Steingraber explains that experiments with dogs demonstrated that aromatic amines, chemicals used in synthetic dyes, can cause bladder cancer. Okay. So that really sums up, if you look at the key words in that sentence, it really sums up the bulk of that paragraph. That you've got experiments, you've got dogs, you've got the aromatic amines, which are the chemicals, and then you have the bladder cancer. Okay. All of those things are discussed. And if we went back and looked at that paragraph, we'd be able to find those key words: bladder cancer, dogs, amines, chemicals, synthetic dyes. We'd be able to see all of that in that big paragraph. And what this summary has done is condense that into one sentence. Has condensed Steingraber's main point into one sentence. Notice also here that there's a signal phrase with the author's name. Steingraber explains. So therefore, at the end, we only have the page number, not author's last name and page number. But just like with paraphrasing, just like with quoting, we have to put an in-text citation. Even though we are not using the words of the source directly, even though we're putting them into our own words, we are using Sandra Steingraber's ideas here. We're using the conclusion that she reached about bladder cancer based on these chemicals, so we'd have to give her credit, and we would do that with the in-text citation there. We talked about signal phrases. Your book gives you some suggestions on how to do that. You know, I mentioned some of these. These are some verbs that you could use if you're introducing an author. You could say the author acknowledges, the author admits, the author illustrates, the author argues. You could also do according to the author. So have a look at some of these, and you could vary them throughout your paper. You don't have to use the same one all the time. But some of them are going to be used in different contexts. Like, for example, if you're talking about an author critiquing something or criticizing something, you might want to use deny. You might want to use disputes if the author is critiquing something or arguing against something. Or you might want to use the author supports this, the author backs this up, the author agrees with this. Okay, so have a look at those. That's generally what I have to say about summarizing and paraphrasing. But just a reminder, the bulk of what you're going to be doing in your papers should be summarizing and paraphrasing, in addition to some quotes every now and then. But quoting should not be the majority of what you're doing in your papers. Okay, you should do your best to try to understand and put the ideas into your own words. Okay.